budget. You all are thankfully focusing a great deal on that. And it was, what I can at least say is there's no tax increases in it. But, you know, since I'm starting there, that's the good news. The bad news is, in a year when we grew the budget again, largely it was natural growth of our economy and taking in more taxes. None of that money went to transportation. Zero. And when you're talking about a special session, the problem with that is, well, there are two. One, I and virtually everybody else running for the General Assembly last year said, transportation is a top priority for me. You know, blah, blah, blah. And if it's a priority, you put it in the budget. Your budget reflects your priorities. And it is not in there. And that should tell you just how much of a priority it is. Brian Moran and I were on News Channel 8 last week doing our synopses of the legislature. And that was a major point of distinction. He doesn't want to take any money out of the general fund, that's income taxes, sales taxes, corporate taxes, to pay for transportation. And in my view, if it's a priority, transportation, then you know, you don't characterize it as Brian would and say, well, you know, you're taking teachers from the children. No, you're getting them to school. And if you want them to get to school, they've got to have roads. You know, I'm as anti-tax as they come, but these things cost money. And we need to put together, within the budget we've got now, a system that we don't have now that will properly finance transportation and maintenance, construction and maintenance, without the Dick Saslaw huge tax increases that he wants. And if the other side is going to continue to entirely cut off the general fund, which is half of our budget, it's 19 of the $38 billion budget, 19 billion of the 38 billion. If you just take that off the table, you've taken all of your general tax revenues off the table. And if you're not going to share those with transportation, what you're saying is it's not important enough. And that's what you're saying. And legislators' first job with money, with the budget, is to prioritize. And what we've seen in recent years, go back to 2004, the 2004 tax increase, what we're seeing is reverse prioritization. We fund everything we like, all the lollipops. And then we get down to what government really ought to be doing. And we say, well, we're out of money. We need a tax increase. There's nothing else we can do. And anybody like me who stands up and says, now wait a minute, why don't we get rid of some of the lollipops? They just go, they scream. They don't argue with you. They don't actually engage you in a rational debate. They just scream. You can't ask that question. And then it's the Brian Moran stuff. I don't want to sacrifice education to do. You know what? Education got a $1.1 billion increase this year. Transportation got zero. Zero out of the general fund. Zero. Now, if you turned a little more than a third of that increase over to transportation and you held it there as we go forward in our budget, you'd fully finance the maintenance budget. And if you've been listening closely, you hear that the maintenance money is going to run out in 2018. Well, it doesn't have to. The money is there if we were committed to setting it aside for maintenance. I have some other ideas about how to do that as well. But as we went through this session, of course, the Supreme Court ruling was right at the end. It was with 1 week to go, the Supreme Court had ruled the taxing authorities unconstitutional. And since I occasionally encounter some confusion about this, I want everybody to understand, I voted against those authorities having taxing power. I think that was A, horrible policy, and B, it was unconstitutional, and I said so at the time. I also thought, if you're going to do abuser fees, which I voted against every other time, that to exclude non-Virginians was both bad policy and unconstitutional. To me, if where you live determines your potential punishment for breaking the law, that violates equal protection. It's really kind of first-year law school to me. And taxes on services were added by the governor there at the veto session last year. Very bad ideas. And thankfully, the court saved us from ourselves a little bit. And there was a stampede, even with how bad the governor's amendments were last year, to push this through and to run home and say, look, we did something. Something was done. Look at me, we're busy. Isn't this great? And that was really kind of the mentality by the veto session. There was no serious analysis of the shortcomings with what the governor had proposed in 3202. And whatever you thought of the underlying bill, the governor made what was kind of an ugly pig a stinking skunk. I mean, it was awful by the time he was done with it. And there were a lot of people who just, they wouldn't get off the train. You know, no, we got to have this, and what if he vetoes it? Well, then let him veto it. If you return to him without these awful amendments, let him veto it. You know, if I look back a year prior to last year, I carried the ball on property rights for 3 years. I put in a bill to change public use in Virginia before Kelo. If you go back and check my legislation in 2005, 6 months before the Kelo decision, you'll find my public use bill, which would have dramatically limited what government could do. So 2006 now, the political heat was on because of the Kelo decision. Well, we got to the last day, the very last day, and I was on the conference committee. And the deal was a mediocre bill or no bill. And I made the call among the property rights folks that we were going to have no bill. This is a fundamental, foundational principle that, you know, if you're going to argue, are we going to fix the potholes on I-95 or 606, you can compromise there. There's room to talk and to deal. When what you're talking about was what George Mason thought was one of the most fundamental aspects of the protections that we got as Americans, and for which reason, in its absence, he wouldn't support the Constitution, and that is the Fifth Amendment, property rights, that it's not something you compromise on. You've got to do that one right. And we pulled the plug on that, and I spent a year working to build grassroots support against virtually every moneyed interest in Richmond. They are all lined up against property rights. Local governments, VDOT, every state agency, all the universities, utilities, developers who would occasionally get a great deal because cities would condemn property, give it to the developer, and say, hey, make us something wonderful that we can then tax. Norfolk was doing it, Stanton was doing it. I mean, it's all over the place. And despite being a southern state, a lot of people didn't realize Virginia has some of the worst property rights protection in the country, or we had. So I pulled the plug on that in 2006, and in 2007, in the face of an election, we had a lot of pressure on, and we got an A-plus bill. What we didn't get is a constitutional amendment, but we did get a bill that now dramatically restricts government power in using eminent domain, which is, to me, a tremendous advance. And it also points to the approach that should have been used when the governor's amendments to 3202 came. We should have stared him straight in the face and said, this is bad policy. And we shouldn't have passed it for what were considered meager political reasons. And we did not include me at that point. But there just weren't enough other people who were willing to stand in the way of that train. And that's very unfortunate. Thankfully, the Supreme Court, like I said, sort of saved us from ourselves. Now we're looking at a special session.